Live. Thank you guys for joining us as we start our everybody who's joining us to help us crush the social media algorithms by sharing this link everywhere you can and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So we're gonna get right started today with our live stream. We have two very, very special guests and of course our very own staff writer, Alan McLeod. Before I introduce them, I'd like to give you guys a little bit of background about what we are talking about. Much has been made about the U.S.'s strong economic, political, and military ties with Israel, but far fewer people realize that the apartheid state has powerful backers in Europe as well, particularly the United Kingdom, where the conservative government under Boris Johnson is signing deals to send weapons and military training to Israel. Yet even as this is going on, a growing movement within the country is challenging the government's unwavering support for apartheid. We even saw a record number of people on the streets in London to protest the UK's support for Israel. Yet even as his, hold on a second, I think we're over here. So chief among those in solidarity with Palestine is Palestine Action. It's a new activist group that has made headlines after occupying and shutting down a number of weapons factories in the UK, including Elbit Systems, supporting the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and aiding in Israel's bombardment in Gaza. So joining us to talk about that are Huda Ammari and Richard Bernard, the co-founders of Palestine Action. Thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us. We really appreciate the press's coverage, so we're really glad to be here.
Thank you. Well, it's an honor to be speaking with you guys. I feel like you guys are like real life superheroes who are really standing up to the true villains in our society, which are the weapons manufacturers. You guys have gone to the core of the issue here when it comes to the UK supporting apartheid Israel and its military might against Palestinians. And so, Huda, could you first lay out how the UK is supporting Israel militarily, economically, and politically?
Yeah, definitely. So it's no surprise to people that the UK is deeply complicit with Israel's apartheid regime. And for us, we often highlight how this complicity spans back over 100 years at the beginning of the Balfour Declaration, where essentially the foreign minister at the time issued a declaration calling for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, of the indigenous population of Palestine, from their homes in order to make a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine, which obviously meant wiping out the Palestinians from their homes. And this complicity and support for Israel's apartheid regime just continues until this very day. And something that we highlight and focus a lot on is how it's been going on for over 100 years, and now the UK hosts several of Israel's arms factories here in the UK, including Elbit Systems, which is actually Israel's largest arms company, who have the audacity to market their weapons as tested, because when they bomb the Gaza Strip and harass Palestinians in the largest open-air prison in the world, then they use this as an opportunity to market their weapons and essentially sell these weapons onto other oppressive regimes across the world to kill more civilians and harass oppressed people everywhere. And I think people have not necessarily noticed that these companies are all around us building these components in our towns and cities. So we try and directly affect and halt that production from where we are and where we can make material change.
Okay, great. And Richard, if you could just kind of lay out some of the actions that you guys have taken against Elbit Systems. Tell us what you guys have been doing.
Okay, yeah. First of all, maybe I can just pick up on, we don't see ourselves and the other people in Palestine Action as heroes at all. We're very much ordinary people. We've had people who are 18 years old. We've had people who are 74 years old take part in our actions. We seek in all of our actions to take direct actions. We don't appeal to governments. We don't do protests. I myself, many years ago, went on a march of over 1 million people in London to march against the Iraq war. And it failed. Yeah, it didn't matter how many people were out there. The government didn't change. They still killed loads of people. I still feel Huda talks about her family in Iraq and what the occupying American and British forces did. So for us, marches and demonstrations and petitions are not enough. When we see what's happening day in, day out in Palestine, we must match the resistance that they call for. So our actions seek to always disrupt, expose, and ultimately destroy the companies that profit from the Israeli apartheid regime. And therefore, it started off with simple things. We stormed an office and graffitied in it and disrupted their business. And then more and more our actions have actually been going to the factories where these evil weapons and the evil parts, the drones are made. And we disrupt it by locking people to gates, by climbing on top of the building, by spraying red paint all over the building to signify the blood of the Palestinian people. That we use a natty trick by using fire extinguishers, old ones, recycled of course, filled with blood red paint. And more so as well, actually damaging the infrastructure of the building. Often people will level at us, how is committing criminal damage helping the cause? But for us, we don't see ourselves as criminal or causing criminal damage. We see ourselves as dismantling the Israeli war machine and the Israeli apartheid regime where it started. So our actions have been shutting those factories down for time, for 1 day at a time, for some up to 3-4 weeks once we've caused the damage so they can't go back in. And they look, we purposely designed them to expose things and get the message out as well. But they're really rather simple. It just means putting a ladder on the side of a building and climbing up onto it and, you know, taking a hammer or other things to cause damage. For us, the key thing is to disrupt that production line, disrupt the way that these evil weapons are made, and to cost them in their pocket. These people, as Hood has said before, these, you know, evil companies market their weapons unbelievably as tested on people before selling them elsewhere. And we will not allow that to happen. We will damage their business. We will cost them money. At the present count, we might have cost them up to £10 million in increased security, in damage and lost production. And we think this is the only way that will actually ultimately achieve any form of success for the Palestinian people and for other oppressed people, the Kashmiri people across the world that are the victims of these evil companies and their weapons.
Absolutely. The military industrial complex, no matter what weapons manufacturing firm or company it is, reigns supreme when it comes to conflict the world over. And it's fueling British Empire, US Empire, and NATO conflicts around the world that is basically being fueled by bloodshed. I mean, that's what we're seeing. And so I commend you both for the courage that you have and setting the example of what true resistance and activism looks like in the West. Here in the United States, and I want Alan to kind of talk about this, in the United States, we don't see, I think, that kind of direct action against weapons manufacturers, like the kind of action you are taking. And I personally think it's perhaps because of the brutality of the police state here in the United States. Police are armed to the T. The media coverage also paints a lot of protesters, whether it's at Standing Rock, at native tribes that are, protecting their water and their land. They are labeled and painted as terrorists. And so I'm just curious to know, how is the media coverage in the UK when it comes to covering PAL action? Alan, if you can talk about this, and you guys can also talk about your experience with this after he's done, versus media coverage of like protest movements in the United States. Alan, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose when you look at Western media accounts of clashes, in Israel's occupation of Palestine, the word clash comes up a lot. It's a great word that they can use to kind of just refuse to apportion responsibility or violence or tone to anything. What we saw, with Israel's latest attack on Gaza last month was that media did describe it as a clash between Israel and Hamas. But of course, a much more accurate way of saying it would be Israeli attack on Palestine. And that's always what media tend to try and do. They try to frame it as a sort of Israel versus Hamas rather than Israeli government versus Palestinian people. They also tend to present Israel as responding to actions. It's right out of the Israeli government playbook, actually. They talk about how Israel is responding to Palestinian aggression, whether that's crazy concepts like terror balloon, or they talk about rockets as if they're the reincarnation of Saturn V or General Dynamics' finest. They also tend to use things like, they use tricks like using the active voice for when Israelis die versus the passive voice for when Palestinians die. So we'll see a lot of headlines saying things like 5 Israelis killed and 26 Palestinians die, as if where there's somehow, you know, a lack of clarity over where and why these Palestinians are dying. One great example of this is CNN and its Jerusalem bureau chief, Andrew Carey. At the height of the violence last month, he sent out a memo to all CNN staff saying that we have to remember whenever we're quoting the Gazan Ministry of Health, we have to write Hamas run in front of it. So what he was doing there was really trying to kill the messenger before the message even got out there, which was that the Israeli government and the Israeli military were attacking Gaza and causing enormous amounts of casualties by undermining that, by saying, well, this number comes from Hamas. And there's also a complete lack of historical context within much of the reporting, so that even people who are engrossed in this a lot of the time don't even know the basic facts about what happened in 1948 or 1967, to the point that studies show that that a lot of Americans seem to think that it's actually Palestine that's occupying Israel and not the other way around. Yeah, when you said about how the UK and the US is a little bit different, as you said, the US does have armed police, the UK doesn't. The UK also has quite a long labor history and a radical movement which has had a lot of success in direct actions. But I'd be hesitant in holding up the United Kingdom as like a bastion of liberty or a place where, you know, it's a particularly radical past. I mean, if we compare ourselves to the French, who are constantly going on strike and constantly destroying things when their government or when big corporations do things that are against the wishes of the people, I think we start to look like, you know, wallflowers in comparison. And then, of course, there's the fact that I think militarism has just become totally normalized in the US, to the point where we see advertisements for joining the army, or even advertisements for big weapons companies if you live in Washington, D.C. That sort of thing doesn't really happen outside of the center of the world empire. And so sometimes, yeah, if you live in the eye of the hurricane, things can seem a little bit different to whether you do in the rest of the world.
And so, Huda and Richard, you know, either one of you can answer to this. How has been the media coverage in the UK about your actions? Do they paint you guys as terrorists like they do here in the US? What is the media coverage like? I mean, does the BBC cover your actions and show it as like this heroic thing?
So we do get quite a bit of media coverage, and it has been quite a challenge to get that. I think a lot of it is due to when you take direct action and we're on the roof of these buildings and, you know, we're dismantling their infrastructure, as we mentioned before, and covering them in red paint, it gets to a point when we get so much community support that it's very difficult for them to not cover our actions. Whether or not that's the best coverage we've got, probably not. And often there is a subtext, as you mentioned, of clashes and a bit of propaganda basically on the situation. But I think more and more when people see our actions, it kind of goes through all of that propaganda with the media. And I think people understand that we're taking on an Israeli arms company, we're testing weapons on Palestinians, a population where the majority of people are children. And how can that be wrong? And we've actually had an immense amount of support. And recently, unfortunately, it happened when Gaza was being so brutally attacked, that we have got much more mainstream support, which, I mean, I was quite frustrated about, to be honest, because it's just frustrating to know that it takes people being massacred for things to turn around. But nonetheless, you know, we have an opportunity now where we're meeting more and more people to further our campaign to shut Elbit Systems down and hopefully send a message to all companies who profit from Israel's apartheid regime. But I think more and more for us, we're seeing our social media has actually been the main tool in terms of getting the word out. We were quite, you know, surprised that on our Instagram, we went up in 1 week from 6,000 to I think it was over 30,000 in a week. And that has been where most people have seen what we're doing and are joining us. And that is something that we have control over. Nonetheless, we do get many posts removed, and we have had our Facebook page removed. We've had 8 different third-party platforms take us down, including fundraising pages, etc. And although the media hasn't necessarily painted us as terrorists, myself and Richard have been stopped and interrogated for hours under Schedule 7 counter-terrorism law on our activities in Palestine Action, and detained as such, and had our laptops stolen by the terrorism police, simply because we were active in Palestine Action. And I think we've seen, just 3 weeks after we launched Palestine Action, there was a meeting between the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs and Dominic Raab, who's quite high up in the UK government, as I'm sure you know. And they were basically discussing about and asking for the UK to crush us as a movement. And to be honest, when we read that, we were absolutely elated, because we said, if they're having a meeting of this level to try and stop us, then we're building something which is really going to get under their skin, to the point where they're taking that action. And having done this activism, Palestine activism for years, I felt like we really hit the nail on the head, where we make the messaging very clear and simple as well. And because so much of the propaganda tries to make things look like it's two-sided or complicated, etc., we wanted to just simplify it from the get-go and go, these are war criminals, they're profiting from bloodshed, and they must be shut down. And to try and take away a bit of that propaganda that we get from the mainstream news, and say, how can an arms company be doing a good thing in any sense? Essentially, this is Israel's largest arms company. Everything we say that they do, which is exactly what they promote, is the true face of Israeli apartheid. If they're testing weapons on children, they're providing Israel's military regime, we can cut through as much as possible their propaganda.
Well, it's pretty incredible. I mean, London is the home, as I mentioned in my intro, to one of the largest protests and marches for Palestine. So there's no question that there is growing awareness about Israel's crimes against Palestinians, and people are fed up around the world for Israeli support of Israeli apartheid. They want their governments to end that support. And so I think when people see what you guys are doing, I mean, they look at it as an example of, you guys are hitting it exactly where it hurts, which is at the weapons manufacturers' offices. Richard, I know members of Palestine Action, like you kind of briefly mentioned that you guys have faced legal consequences for your actions. Can you tell us about that, and where, what's happening now? What are you guys facing?
So I think, and actually someone's just put in the chat about staying anonymous. Most of our actions, certainly the high profile ones, we know we're going to get nicked, arrested, at the end of it. There's no way you're going to escape from an arms factory if you cause £4 million worth of damage, like 3 people did, and you're on a roof. So there's a case of, and there's also a sacrificial element to that, which we see in bringing in people to the cause. So the crackdown we face, obviously people get arrested for that. They face charges of often criminal damage or aggravated trespass or conspiracy, all of which face, the maximum period of time in jail for these things is counted as 10 years. We don't expect people to face that amount of time. And certainly in a US context, I think US courts are much more strict than the British courts on these. And we've seen movements in the US in the past. Can think of famous cases of people like Catholic workers who've often used red paint and spread paint on arms dealers and faced quite high convictions. So but I think the key thing for us is that there's never actually been a case go to court. We've been going for this for nearly a year. Myself and Huda and others were involved prior to this, and we always had cases dropped the day before a trial. We see the trial and the court cases as a way of getting them, Elbit Systems and the Israeli apartheid regime, into court and exposing them as much as us. So we see that as part of our activism. People have, I said, those are the sort of things that people have faced. We have had people held on remand, which is held before a hearing, some people for up to a week. And we've actually got one person in prison as we speak, who has been in prison for 2 weeks after taking action at a company called Archonic that made the cladding for Grenfell Tower, which was a disaster in the centre of London, where the company have basically had no repercussions, despite the fact that they knew that they were making using cladding on materials that were very not fire retardant, and they also made parts for Israeli warplanes. So we have a person in prison at the moment who's been there for 2 weeks and is on hunger strike with 4 demands. So we've seen this, but it's very difficult to tell what the actual final repercussions are, because the state and the British police, and we would say the establishment linked with the Israeli apartheid regime and Albert systems, are playing some sort of political game. And as we've seen the more of a mass movement come about this, rather than it be a niche kind of interest, then the state seem to have backed off slightly with regards to this, because they don't want to, imprison people too quickly and crush movements, and they couldn't do that because so many people come on board. And we actually see more and more people going, I don't care about the consequences. This is happening to people in Palestine now. If I have to face prison time now, I would really rather not, but I will do this and face that. And certainly most people who take Palestine actions know they're going to face 24 hours in a police cell before being released and entering the court system. We have seen trumped up charges. I'm on charges of blackmail, which is a maximum sentence of 14 years in prison. And that's blackmail for saying if a company wouldn't evict Elbit, that we could go on hunger strike, or activists would continue to target them. So we have seen those trumped up charges, but it's very difficult to tell the political game they're playing in the background and what's exactly happening on that. And we also have this, there's also like little chinks you see in the armor that fill us with, I'm not going to sort of hold out for the British state and the British courts to look after us, but we see little chinks. So I myself was in Westminster Magistrates Court for answering the blackmail charges, and I was on strict curfew for bail conditions. And the prosecuting attorney got up and said, "Oh, I don't think he should be on bail conditions at all." And afterwards, our barrister came up to him and went, "Don't worry, he's pro-Palestine. That's why he asked for you to have no conditions." So we see those little chinks happening. And those are the moments when we start to think, actually, we're getting somewhere. And I suppose I just sum this bit up by going, which ties into the press thing. There's a general principle with direct action and other movements. First of all, they ignore you, then they oppress you, and then you win. And hopefully we're aiming towards that third end.
Okay, so you think you're in the second stage right now, and
moving to the third.
We're moving to the third.
I do think that you guys are winning, and I think there's even a huge shift within governments and politicians that are kind of, I don't know if it's out of a good heart or if it's just out of total embarrassment that they don't want to be on the wrong side of history, because it's so obvious that Israel's an apartheid regime, just like South Africa was an apartheid regime, and there was just so much global support to dismantle the apartheid regime in South Africa. We're seeing that wave happening right now around the world. And you mentioned the brother who is on a hunger strike for 2 weeks. I know that his identity is private to the public. I want to talk about the story of the Grenfell Tower and the company Archonic that makes the cladding and its ties to Israeli weapons. Can one of you guys talk about that connection and more about Archonic's ties with Israeli weapons and warplanes?
Yes, definitely. So Archonic is, as mentioned briefly before, is the company which essentially provides the cladding for the Grenfell Tower, where just over 4 years ago, 72 people were killed in a fire. And despite the company having prior knowledge and understanding that they should not be selling that type of cladding to tower blocks, because exactly this kind of thing could happen where a lot of people will die due to a fire, they continue to sell on this cladding. And in fact, there are many tower blocks across the UK who still have this cladding to this day here. And despite, and the very same company, which I think says a lot, the same company actually build and provide materials for Israel's fighter jets, which are used to kill and massacre Palestinians, especially in Gaza. And we saw these fighter jets be used in the recent attacks on the people of Gaza. And I think it's quite appropriate target in the sense that these very same companies who have a disregard for human life when it comes to people living in London have the same disregard for human life when it comes to people in Palestine, and essentially all boils down to trying to make a profit rather than regarding human life or following any kind of moral code. And despite there being a government inquiry for 4 years where all of this evidence has come up about Archonic, emails between their senior staff, about knowing about these, about exactly what this cladding could do, nothing has happened to a single senior staff member at Archonic or the company at all. There have been no repercussions, no accountability, and essentially it's similar to exactly how our governments continue to not just ignore what's happening to Palestinians, but to enable it and profit from the oppression of the Palestinian people and people across the world. And how governments essentially protect these companies if it's through doing these inquiries, which actually no repercussions are brought about. And for Palestine Action, we saw the 4-year anniversary of Grenfell as the appropriate time to seek justice for those people killed in Grenfell and to seek justice for the people killed in Palestine, and to highlight just how these companies are basically all around us. And I think, you know, that a lot of these actions that we do as well highlight just how close to home it is to people. And often people don't realize that those companies are there until we're on top of the building and highlighting exactly what is happening. They just look like a normal business in a normal industrial park, where actually those components and the products that they are building are causing havoc and destruction in other parts of the world.
Well, and a lot of these major companies that are, you know, the ones that are building the buildings, they're the ones that own the real estate. They're all tied to the government and to politicians and the companies, the weapons manufacturers, and they're the ones responsible for the profits. That all goes back to the 1% billionaire class. So it's all tied, but there's like this tangled web where it's all tied together. Alan, I'm curious to know about the changing of support within the UK altogether within government. If you know of any politicians, or maybe if there's like a wave of change that's taking place in the UK that's moving in the direction of supporting Palestinian human rights. Do you see that wave happening?
Well, compared to the United States, the United Kingdom, our parliament is certainly a lot more progressive on Palestine in certain ways. Certainly, under Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party moved towards a much more pro-Palestinian position. Parts of the UK are more progressive than others. I know that, for instance, my old city, Glasgow, the council, the city chambers flies the Palestinian flag regularly above their building. There's a lot of support for Palestine in Ireland and Northern Ireland, particularly among the Catholic population, who often see their struggle with independence and the occupation, as they see it, of Northern Ireland as to be fundamentally linked with the Israeli occupation of Palestine. So you'll very often see Palestinian flags at, say, Celtic football matches or in Irish football matches as well. There's a lot of iconography and a lot of links between the two. However, if you actually look at the Tory government that's in power right now, Boris Johnson continually says that he's, got unwavering support for Israel. And of course, the UK government, Israel is one of their favorite clients in terms of actually selling weapons. Not only that, there's a small amount of UK troops actually stationed in Israel who are there primarily to give training and various forms of support to the IDF. So the UK government is actually directly complicit in a lot of the crimes that Israel is carrying out across the Middle East. And so while there is a lot of widespread public disenchantment with what the government is doing, there's still not that sort of spark which is creating this mass movement to change that.
Well, and you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn at the very beginning, and like here in the US, we have people like Bernie Sanders, and we have people that are in the squad like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and Alexandria Cortez, and they all kind of take different stances on Israel and Palestine. But like Bernie Sanders, for example, he's actually given a platform within mainstream news when it comes to Palestine. He's heavily critiqued, of course, but also, he kind of gives a more liberal Zionist support to Palestine, where he says, Palestinians are humans, they deserve human rights. but Israel has a right to defend itself. And I feel like this is really problematic because obviously it's a very much a liberal Zionist talking point, because it upholds Israel as a legitimate state that, you know, has a right to defend itself against a, you know, defenseless population. He doesn't actually describe Israel as an occupying force. He doesn't support BDS. And yet a lot of progressives in the United States stand behind Bernie Sanders' stance in that. Whereas people like Rashida Tlaib, who is Palestinian, and Ilhan Omar, they'll support like a one-state solution, and they'll support BDS. And they're constantly being targeted in smear campaigns and called anti-Semitic. And even Bernie Sanders, even though he's a liberal Zionist, he's still called like a self-hating Jew for taking that stance, for even just for uttering the words Palestinians deserve human rights. So I'm just curious, you know, Richard and Huda, how has the anti-Semitism card played in terms of like affecting pro-Palestine support in the UK? What do you like? How do you guys feel about this?
So for me, I was before Palestine Action, I was involved in a lot of different ways of trying to, you know, pursue the Palestinian cause, and particularly an arms embargo between the UK and Israel. And I was quite active within the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. And it was actually my mum, who's Iraqi, who told me to join the Labour Party, which I was quite surprised about, because obviously it was Labour who went and supported the war and invasion in Iraq, so to speak. And when Jeremy Corbyn came in, there was a new lease of hope that this would be a channel where we could actually facilitate and create change, not just for people in the UK, but for people in the Middle East and across the world, and especially in Palestine, because he's a strong supporter of the Palestinian people. And it was actually in 2019 where we saw for the first time ever that there was an arms embargo between the UK and Israel on the Labour manifesto. And then obviously the anti-Semitism smears and other attacks on Corbyn basically destroyed all hope of that being the channel where we would get that change that we needed. So essentially, you know, it had catastrophic consequences in terms of, you know, we were quite close to a potential of an arms embargo, and then it just went out the window basically overnight.
Basically, the anti-Semitism card just hijacks the whole thing. It just hijacks all the activism that takes place, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, it's quite disturbing to see just how much it penetrated British politics, and how it actually distracted our own conversations when we were talking about activism and what we can do for the Palestinian people, because we were constantly trying to defend ourselves about not being anti-Semitic, and against these smears, but actually we lost track about focusing on, you know, on what we needed to create that change. So it took us backwards quite a lot, which was obviously the intention of all of the anti-Semitism smears during that time. And I think, and it obviously it's continuing as a tactic. At the same time, for us, starting Palestine Action, that was exactly why we, you know, for a number of reasons, where we said we were going for Israel's arms trade, we're going for Elbit Systems, we're going to make the message clear. This is what Israel's largest arms company does. They test weapons on Palestinians. They're building weapons here which will be used to kill and harass and destroy people's lives across the world. It couldn't be any more simpler. And actually, at the start, there were some attempts to accuse us of being anti-Semitic, and I think it came from one Friends of Israel page, and there was about 1,000 quote tweets going, "This is an arms company, it's ridiculous." And actually, for us, focusing on that and keeping the focus on the arms trade, which is the face of Israel's apartheid regime, has managed to keep us clear of having to defend ourselves on that, because I think to most ordinary people, attacking an arms company is in no way racist, because obviously, you know, what Israel does is extremely racist towards the Palestinian people. It's the whole apartheid regime is built on racism, and testing weapons and using Gaza as a laboratory is one of the most sickening forms of which manifests under an apartheid regime, which we've highlighted, and I think they've really failed to attack us based on those you know, allegations.
The only thing I would add to that, pretty much the only time that it's been screamed in our faces is by the cops. in an interview, screaming at me, "You're not an anti-racist, you're an anti-Semite."
Right.
And he was kind of just repeating the tropes, the right-wing tropes. And in a way, it kind of like makes you smile. And as Huda said, the thing for us is not to get bound up in that, because more and more people, younger people, have joined us because of the activism, who haven't been particularly, necessarily focused on the Palestinian cause, and they get the simplistic message of it. And we wouldn't want to get sidetracked. We can let the police shout us about that all they like, and we've purposely sought not to get drawn into those political debates that take us away from the mission and keep things simple about this is an oppressed group, and oppressed people who have weapons tested on them, and to get that in brings in people from movements who wouldn't probably have touched it before.
Right.
And I think there's a great page in one of Angela Davis' books where she talks about the Palestinian struggle and say it's been over-intellectualized by the left and causes that problem. And I think this anti-Semitic slur can be a real danger if people go down it too much defensively and rather come out on the front foot.
I agree with you. I think that, when we are cornered, we kind of tend to get in that defensive mode, and then we have to sit there and explain ourselves over and over again. And the whole action or cause that we are fighting for gets lost in this conversation. And I think that's what happened with people like Ilhan Omar in the United States. She was targeted in such a heavy smear campaign and called anti-Semitic for bringing attention to how much influence the Israeli lobby has, that the whole conversation became about anti-Semitism now. Forget that Israel has this huge, heavy hand in US government and politics in the United States. Forget how much these politicians are getting paid by AIPAC, the American Israeli Affairs Committee. Forget all that. Now it's all about this anti-Semitism trope, like you mentioned. And you guys, made it very clear that you don't believe that these protest movements are effective. They're important, but not effective in actually stopping action. I tend to agree with you. When Israel was bombing Gaza very heavily, like I live in Minneapolis, and there was action all across the country. Yes, it took all of that bloodshed to get people out on the streets to take action. But when Israel stopped bombing Gaza, everybody just kind of disappeared and went back to their daily lives and just had dinner and back to their families. And it was as if nothing had happened. And so I'm curious to know, what kind of advice do you give people on what true activism looks like? I know you described what you guys do, but like if you were to have a conversation with somebody who says, yeah, I'm going to get on the streets and protest, like what would you tell them?
I think I'd say a few things on this. To directly answer the question, I think there's many ways that we can take it a step further, and often it is highlighting there are companies out there who are profiting from the bloodshed of the Palestinian people, who are all around us and actually targeting that and causing disruption to that financial flow which they gain from the bloodshed, which makes it unprofitable for them or a negative thing for them to actually be working with Israel's apartheid regime in any way. Is exactly what we need to do. If we had 100,000 people storm different offices across the country, then they would have to be forced to make an impact. And sometimes it's as simple as just walking into one of these buildings or these businesses and actually saying, we're going to sit here and we're going to disrupt this business, and we're going to go in and day out, and we're going to have clear targets. And for us, that's something that we took on, which was the clear target, because we didn't want to spread our resources too thin, because there are so many companies out there who are facilitating Israel's regime. And in order to win and be effective, it is better to be focused. And although there are different repercussions in different countries, I think there's also a diversity of tactics that people can use. Things like blockading different businesses across the US, as we've done in the UK in different actions. And I think often when people look at our actions, they only necessarily see the people who are on the roof causing high-level amounts of damage, but actually we've had all sorts of different types of actions take place, from people chaining themselves to gates, lying in front of the gates of the business, which actually is very effective at occupying and disrupting that space. But I think rather than appealing, there is little to no point of going into a park and calling for freedom of Palestine when there is no clear demand, and we're not directly affecting anybody who's actually profiting from the oppression of those people. And I think for us, direct action is not appealing to government or not appealing to a middleman to create the change that we want to see. It's envisaging that future that we want to see and making it reality. So in our case, it is saying we're not going to appeal anymore to the government to have an arms embargo. We're going to stop their arms export, and we're going to stop Israel's arms production ourselves, using our own bodies, because they have ignored us time and time again. And at the end of the day, people are dying. They are suffering under Israel's regime. People in Kashmir are suffering all across the world. And much of our privilege in the West is built off the oppression of people across the world. And that requires us having some form of sacrifice and understanding those links and being organized and being effective, and to not keep appealing to the same murderers. Because, for me and for us, the government and the politicians who killed 1 people in Iraq, who continue to massacre people across the world, who facilitate Israel's apartheid regime, are complicit in murder. And they're not going to change because we ask them or we shout at them, etc. Because for them, we see it all the time. We see 200,000 people protest for Palestine, and then 200,000 people protest for another thing or another thing. And for them, it's just noise. And we've grown sick of it here. We saw 1 million people protest against the Iraq war. And what bigger show of democracy could that be, that they just went against all of that and went and killed 1 million people? Whereas maybe if 10% of those people went to those arms companies and stopped the production or disrupted them or blockaded the export of those weapons, then we could have had a significant disruption to the business of bloodshed, essentially.
Absolutely. And go ahead, Richard.
I'll just add 2 things to that. I think when you asked the question about what would you ask somebody if they went out on the streets, say for the first time, I would kind of say they should ask 2 questions of themselves. Do you actually want to win? Is the first one, right? Are these just performative things? Yeah. And don't get me wrong, there's stuff around solidarity, and but I think that would be linked to my second question. If it was you who were the oppressed people, what would you be asking for people to do? Would it be enough that they stand at the gates and light a candle? That's a part, yeah? Or do you want them to go in and tear it down? And I think those 2 questions must be asked all the time. And when we're not sitting superiorly asking that, because we ask ourselves those 2 questions day in, day out. When, as I mentioned, before Palestine Action, both me and Huda have taken action against Elbit Systems before. And there was a small group of us in one area. We would shut it down once every 6 months, once every year. And even then, we'd be breaking the law. We often wouldn't get arrested, and we go home feeling good about ourselves. But actually, that's not enough. It needs to be sustained. It needs to happen day in, day out. The people who suffer the consequences in Palestine, they're not just suffering when there's bombs going. They have to live that life of having drones fly over their heads every day, of hearing those sounds that fill them with PTSD, of having checkpoints, and that's not enough. And I think people have to ask themselves those questions constantly. Do you actually want to win, or are you going to go out and fly your flags and feel good about yourself? And are you doing enough? What more can you do in your situation, whatever that is? I
just want to add a quick point to this as well. And I think, all in all, it's not only is there a moral duty to take action which is disruptive, but there's also a massive opportunity. The fact that we do live in the West, where a lot of these weapons are built, where a lot of these companies do operate, where they do have their headquarters, where we do actually have an opportunity to disrupt that kill line and affect their profits. And I think when it's as clear as, if we saw people get killed right in front of us, or someone beat up someone right in front of us, most of us would do something or try and get in the way or stop them from doing that. We wouldn't necessarily wait for someone else to come and stop them for us. And I think if we just took things as humanity, as morality, it would be insane that we would have these companies building weapons where essentially it can be an hour down the road from us. And actually those drones or those parts we can see in real time be used in Gaza. And for us, that's an opportunity to disrupt that kill line and affect Israel's apartheid regime from where we are.
Can I just add one other thing? Sorry.
Go ahead.
One other thing I would say is at this time, and young people specifically, they're fed up with established institutions, whether they be political parties, pressure groups, NGOs that have failed us on the climate, that have failed us on Palestine, that have failed us on so many things. Young people, and people have this all the time, we have been approached by lots of individuals and by groups going, why am I stood outside the Israeli embassy shouting at people who are never going to agree to dismantle their wall thing? Yeah, people understand this. Movements such as Extinction Rebellion and other movements that have galvanized lots of young people, lots of disenfranchised people, lots of people, postmodern people who just are not ever going to get involved in standard campaigning, are enlivened by this. And we need to appeal to them and get them out doing things without creating bureaucracies and structures and asking for us to ask permission off the police where we can walk on our protest, which is just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Yeah, for me, that's not a protest. It's people understand this, and really, it's an opportunity for more and more groups, us and other groups, to go, okay, what can we do? How can we go more? What can we push? And not to fall into that trap in our own country of it often being white, elderly, middle class people who run these things. And have a system behind it, but we need to be more fluid. We need to respond, but we also need to build these movements from the bottom up, and respect things. You know, I'm a council estate lad from a working class lad, and respecting that people. I mean, we just don't get involved in things like NGOs who confuse everything the hell out of us. Yeah, it's a simple issue. There's an oppressed people. We feel oppressed. Let's go and do something practical about it.
Absolutely, and we just have about 7 minutes left. Alan, if you can briefly kind of compare U.S. response versus British response to protests. I know that it's very different because in the U.S. the police are armed to the T, and so I'm just curious to know if people in the U.S. could kind of take these kinds of actions without fear of retribution.
Well, there's always fear of retribution wherever you are, even if you're in the most liberal, social democratic place in the world, like you're, doing a protest in Sweden about climate or something. Certainly, as I said before, the American police are trained to use guns. The UK police do not carry guns generally. Only a very small amount of them do, and they have to have special qualifications and licenses for, so you don't really see them. But generally, I think these sorts of protests can be universalized. You have to really think about the consequences and what you're trying to achieve, of course. Ultimately, though, I think certainly these sorts of protests need to be coordinated in a way that might be a bit more effective. Sometimes these sort of things are a one-day only event, and then people go back to their ordinary lives. They're not really building a sort of sustained movement. And what our guests were talking about, in talking about Extinction Rebellion and stuff like that, I think there's a real need to sort of link these sorts of things up and really talk about the root cause of all of this stuff, which is our societal, which is the way society is made up. Because ultimately, I don't think there's going to be peace in Palestine. There's not going to be justice for people in the global South suffering, and there's not going to be, a resolution to the climate problem until all of these things are changed at the same time via a broad political movement, which acknowledges all of these things are, structural defects within our modern capitalist system, and agrees to sort of move forward on all of these things at the same time.
Yeah, and I don't like to be the pessimist in all of this, but the truth is that U.S. empire reigns supreme in the world today, and so while we may through these actions put pressure on these weapons manufacturers, and even through our protest movements and through our organizing and through the BDS movement, we may put enough pressure to dismantle apartheid. It's very possible because we saw it happen in South Africa. And I do see that there's a global wave of support for Palestinian human rights, which is really, really incredible. It's very inspiring. But I think, Alan, and what you guys are saying is true, is that we have to really get to the core of these issues because they're all related. This is not just about Israeli apartheid and its occupation of Palestine, but it's about dismantling the whole entire military-industrial complex that is, shedding blood all over the world through its sanctions wars, through its occupation, its military, adventurism and plundering third world countries of their minerals and their resources. And so it's really, really all connected. I just want to, Oh, go ahead.
Just one thing on that. I mean, the good news, Huda said, like, we live in the global north, most of us watching this, which means we have far more leeway to do things like this. And we actually also have a lot more power than we realize. You know, if you go to places in the global south, which have far fewer resources, places like Bolivia, where there's been a movement to, a grassroots movement to change society for the better, which beat back a coup. They don't talk about how powerless they are, even though a lot of them are, almost don't have two pennies to rub together. They were able to organize and come together to do things. So I think a lot of the time we feel pessimistic, but actually we just feel we should be galvanized by the amount of potential power that we do have.
I mean, I'm just pessimistic about, just US empire, it's just such a strong, its tentacles are spread all across the world in every little thing. But I do have hope for a movement of change. There's absolutely no question that, what you guys are doing is creating it's creating a wave that eventually is going to cause a huge, change of structure within our society. So I really appreciate what you guys have been doing with Pal Action. It's a huge inspiration. Just listening to you guys is just, it really touched my heart. Like, this is how we need to all be thinking at all times. How can we help the oppressed around the world? How can we stand up for those who don't have a voice, who don't have the strength or courage? And you guys do have that strength and courage. So I really appreciate you guys being here. So that is a wrap for today's Mintcast live stream. I know you guys have another live stream coming up. So just a reminder to everybody to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we will extract the audio from this and turn it into a podcast as well. But you can find it on YouTube and on Facebook and on Twitch. Did you guys want to add anything else before I let you go?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you. Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. And thank you, Alan, for joining us today. Have a good day.